Today we're speaking with Professor Bjorn Lomborg, the president of Copenhagen Consensus think tank, the passionate environmental economist, and the brilliant thinker and author. Dr. Lomborg, welcome and thanks so much for your time.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Recently, you called the climate policies of the world's major economies, the US and the EU, as fantastically expensive and perfectly useless. What exactly did you mean by that?
I hope I didn't say perfectly useless. I certainly wanted to say not very effective. So my point is that right now, the world, and certainly the EU, but also the US under Biden and many other places, are spending vast sums of money and promising many, many more sums of money to do very little against climate change. And I think if there's one thing we can agree on, spending lots of money and achieving almost nothing is not a good policy. Look, global warming is a real problem. It's man-made, it is something we should tackle, but we need two things. First of all, we need to sort of step back and take a breath. We get the sense that global warming is this end of the world. And of course, if global warming really was the end of the world, we should throw everything in the kitchen sink at this problem. But it's not. The UN itself, the UN climate panel, tells us that in the 2070s, if we do nothing against global warming, the net impact will be equivalent to each one of us being somewhere between 0.2 and 2% less well off than we otherwise would have been. So remember, by then we'll be 363% richer. So what the UN is really saying is, instead of being 363% richer in 2070, we will be 356% richer. Yes, that's a problem. No, it's not the end of the world. That's important because then we can stop being panicked and we can start being smart. Unfortunately, we're not being smart because we're right now focusing on many interventions that cost a fortune and does almost no good for the climate. Let me just give you one example. The electric car. The electric car is sort of the epitome of much of what's wrong with climate change. The electric car is great. If you've ever driven a Tesla, you'll know it's a lot of fun. Eventually, electric cars will take over a large part of the personal movement segment, so personal automobiles. But we're not there yet. And right now, most governments are spending somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 euros in subsidies for cars that effectively end up cutting a few tons of CO2. That's an incredibly ineffective way of cutting a little CO2. What we need is smarter policies, and that's basically what I've been advocating. If we stop being panicked, if we stop spending a lot of resources doing almost nothing, we can start focusing on the smart investments, which obviously is a carbon tax. Everyone would agree on that, but we don't have that very well, and not even in the EU, and certainly not elsewhere in the world. And then innovation. We need innovation. This is also Bill Gates and many others' point. We don't have the technologies that will actually allow us to cut carbon emissions dramatically at affordable levels unless we innovate a lot more. So let's be smart, stop being panicked, stop spending on bad ideas, and start spending on what actually works.
On one hand, you claim climate change is a real man-made problem, but on the other hand, you cite numbers proving that the climate change impact is far from alarming. Where is this dichotomy?
I actually think this is what you would expect of most real-world problems. No issue, or very, very few issues, are the end of the world. And very, very few things that we've talked a lot about are not problems at all. The people who are saying this is, who are denying climate change are, I would say, just wrong. But the people who are saying this is the end of the world, the extinction rebellions of the world, are also wrong. And there's no good backup. And that's why I cited the UN climate panel to you. The UN climate panel has spent lots of time, they've spent since 1990, producing a lot of reports trying to tell us what is up and down in climate. They're telling us it's a real problem. I'm not a natural scientist. I think they have really done their job in telling us this is right. But I'm looking at, and I work closely with a lot of the economists who've tried to say, all right, so let's try and say, what are all the impacts from climate change? And there will be many of them will be negative. And the simple way I find, when people say, why would, slight temperature rise actually have a negative impact? Well, if you think about, most of the world has been constructed to the historical temperature. That means Helsinki in north is well designed for cold and Athens is well designed for heat. But if the temperature were to change from either of those two places just a little bit, they would be a little out of sync. You'd need, more air conditioners in Helsinki. You'd need more, cooling structures in Athens. And that would also be true if it got colder. Every change would be slightly costly simply because our infrastructure is not settled for it. That's the main problem of climate change. It's not these catastrophic things that you see on CNN. It's these rather mundane but not unimportant issues that our societies will be slightly less well adapted to the future climate. And we need to find a way to do that.
In your latest book, False Alarm, subtitle, How Climate Change Panic Cost Us Trillions, Hurts the Poor, and Fails to Fix the Planet, you claim climate policies could end up hurting much more dramatically, cutting growth.
Yes. So, look, the main point is if you make climate policies, and especially if you make climate policies too early, you basically have to force people to buy less effective, often less reliable energy like solar and wind. Look, there is an argument to do that. That's why you need a carbon tax. But if you do it too much, you're essentially hurting growth more than you're helping with climate change. This is the standard sort of economist welfare cost benefit analysis that you do. If you do a little, it's really smart. If you do a lot, it probably ends up being a bad idea. And that's exactly what climate economics shows us. So the guy who won the Nobel Prize for Climate Economics in 2018, William Nordhaus, the only person who've ever won the Nobel Prize for Climate Economics, he points out, we should look at how much will global warming cost? How much will our policies to tackle global warming cost? Given that we have to pay both the cost of climate change and the cost of the policies, we have to find the place where the sum of those two is at a minimum. That's sort of an economist way of thinking about this problem. And we have not done that so far. So if we end up saying, let's go for net zero, which a lot of countries are now claiming, and the EU has actually decided they want to do, the only country to have done an analysis on that is actually New Zealand. They asked for an independent advice from their premier economics organization to say, how much is that actually going to cost us? Their answer was 16% of GDP by 2050. So that's 16% that you're going to lose every year. Now, remember, they'll be richer by then. So it's not the end of the world economically either, but it's a large chunk of resources. And the problem is you're doing that to solve a less than 2% of a problem. So you're basically paying 16% to avoid 2%. It needs to be a lot more accurate, but I'm just giving you the sort of gist of the argument. That's a bad idea. Spending 16% to avoid part of a 2% problem, bad idea. That's why we need to do this smarter, and we need to do it in a way that doesn't actually end up making more people worse off. And now this was on average, but remember, most of global warming will harm the poor, which makes a lot of people believe that helping poor people is actually what you do with climate policies. But the climate policies will also mostly harm the world's poor. And so that will actually harm them even more. So in some ways, I think there's a real irony here that we're sitting much in the West, feeling very concerned about the poor people of the world and saying, I want to help these people by cutting a ton of carbon emissions, even if it's going to be very costly and it's actually going to end up also hurting them. Instead of saying, what is it that actually troubles these people? They don't have enough food. They don't have good education. They die from easily curable infectious diseases. This is not rocket science. Again, we're a smart civilization. We can walk and chew gum at the same time. We should both do smart climate policies and smart other policies, but we should be careful not to spend so much time and energy on focusing on climate and often doing it badly that we end up forgetting all the other issues that we also have a moral responsibility to fix.
Let's go a bit deeper in this rabbit hole. How and why would it be in anyone's interest to pursue effectively damaging policies? Or are we just talking omission of responsibilities by politicians?
So I think there's a number of different reasons. Obviously, nobody wants to, waste money, although we should also be cognizant that a lot of people stand to gain from this. We have a really bad agricultural policy in the EU. And the reason why we have it is because a lot of farmers make money off of it. And the same way, there's a lot of people who like the climate policies because a lot of people stand to gain a lot of money from it. But I think most of the people who are advocating for this do so because they really want to do well in the world, partly because they're really, really scared. When I talk to a lot of people, also when you look at the surveys, very many people, actually a new survey showed that 49% of all people across 28 nations believe that global warming is likely to lead to the extinction of the human race. That's crazy. That's just not in the remit of what the UN climate panel is telling us at all. But of course, if you believe this is the end of the world, you really say, as AOC said in the US, look, the world is ending in 10 years and you're worried about how much it costs. I can understand that process. If you think it's the end of the world, we should throw all our resources behind just trying to solve this problem. It's not. It's one of the many problems we need to fix in the 21st century. And that's why we need to be much more cognizant. There's another reason. Most politicians are actually trying to sell themselves for the next election. That's often very hard because there's only limited money, and so you can't make everyone happy. And if you try to spread a lot of money around, you also have to raise a lot of taxes, which also annoys people. One of the great things about climate change is that you actually get to promise everything to everyone without having to pay for it. Because you get to say, you're going to die unless you vote for me and I can save you from climate change. I'm going to do that by promising in 2050, we will cut emissions a lot. So you get to get all the votes and somebody else have to pay down the line. That's an ideal setup for politicians. It's like catnip for politicians, right? They just can't stay away from it. And that's why so many politicians have also been walked into this. And I think, I understand why that's happening. But again, if we actually want to leave this world a better place, and I think we all do, we should think really hard about whether delivering very expensive climate promises will actually do fairly little good, even in the far off future, is the best way to do so.
Let's say all the rich countries cut their emissions to zero tomorrow. What would happen?
And it's a very good example. And I've looked at that in the book. I've run this through the UN simple climate model, the one that they use in all their reports. And basically, if you cut all CO2 from all rich countries in the world tomorrow and for the rest of the century, just remember, that would be a terrible world. We would have no way to get around it. It'd be very cold in our apartments right now. We would start burning wood and cut down all our forests just to keep warm, and we'd have lots of indoor air pollution. We'd have very little food. Half the world's population depend on fossil fuels to get their fertilizer that produces their food, and on and on. But even if we imagine that, the net impact by the end of the century would be to reduce temperatures by 0.4 degrees centigrade. I think that's a lot less than what people think. So instead of 4.1 degrees centigrade by the end of the century, it'd be 3.7. Now, that'd still be an advance, but it would be incredibly hard to imagine that the politicians who decided to do this would get reelected. So fundamentally, even if we do this much, we do very, very little for climate. Why? Because 3/4 of all emissions that are missing, that are going to come out in the rest of the century, will come from the non-rich world. So China, India, the rest of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And very obviously, these countries are much, much more concerned about lifting their populations out of poverty, stopping them dying from easily curable infectious diseases, and so on, rather than a temperature rise in 2100. And that's why I keep pointing out, and I think the evidence very clearly shows so. If we keep making the argument, climate policy has to be about making really expensive promises right now. You may get most of the rich world to do it. You will not get most of the poor world to do it. And in your attempt to do so, you may very well make everyone a lot poorer. If you want to find a way to fix climate change, you have to focus a lot more on investing in research and development. Imagine if we could invest in research and development such that we could develop a green energy technology that would be cheaper than fossil fuels. Everyone would switch, not just rich, well-meaning Slovenians or Europeans, But everyone in China and India and Asia and Africa and Latin America, we would be done. So the whole simple point here is to say, if you continue to say we're going to force people to use expensive ways to solve climate change, you'll do a little bit, but not very much. If you innovate the new energies, new green energies down below fossil fuels, everyone will switch. It's really not rocket science. But the problem is it doesn't feel as good because it doesn't feel like, when you put up a solar panel part or a wind turbine part, you can go out and you can show it to the cameras and say, see, we've done something. Unfortunately, you've done very little at fairly high cost. But if you just spend a lot of money on professors in white robes, it doesn't feel like you've done anything. But the point is, this is a century-long problem. We're not going to fix it next year or even the next decade. This is about how we're going to fix it for the rest of the century.
What about the present climate policies? Shouldn't we be hysterical about all the money wasted by them?
We should. I mean, so there's a lot of problem in pinpointing how much money we're wasting. Remember, if you look at Brexit, for instance, most economists will tell you Brexit is going to leave the UK, say, 4% less well off by 2030. It might be 5, it might be 3, who knows? The problem is there's no alternative reality where you could see how much richer the UK would have been had there not been a Brexit. You've only chosen one path. The other one is a model path. It's the same thing with climate. Remember, we know from a lot of models that right now the EU could probably be somewhere between 200 and 400 billion euros richer per year had we not had climate policies. But we don't live in that reality. So the issue here is we can show in the models that that's true. We can also show one of the outcomes of being less well off. One of the problems of having slower growth is that it becomes harder to keep societal cohesion. If everyone grows, everyone says, all right, even if I'm not quite right here, my kids and my grandkids are going to be a lot richer, so I'm okay. If growth slows, everyone starts becoming grumpy. That's why, and I'm totally simplifying, but that's why Italy is very hard to rule, because everyone is dissatisfied because nobody's growing. So the real outcome of having slower growth because of climate policies is that it becomes a little more likely that you have social breakdown, that you have dissatisfied people, and that eventually you will get people, electing Donald Trump and other things. So the outcomes are much more serious in the long run, I think, than most people believe or think about. But the short run impact is, we've just lost a couple $100 billion euros. Who counting? Well, yes, it's not the end of the world for the EU either. We're rich. We can afford to do this. But it has real impacts in the sense this is money that we can't spend on educating our kids better or getting better pensions for our old or better healthcare, all these other things that we can imagine. But it also have long-term cohesion impact on societies.
Can you pinpoint the worst aspects of the present climate policies by the European Union?
So I think the EU has actually done quite a lot of good things. So we have an emission trading system, which we know is, it's sort of a cop-out of trying to do a carbon tax, but not really wanting to because it's politically hard. And it works reasonably well. They've also played it a little bit too much around with it. But fundamentally, that actually means that our climate policies are a lot less costly than they otherwise would have been. We also have a lot of other policies. Many of them are things that politicians come in and say, oh, that would look good. I mentioned the electric cars as a great example of where we're spending enormous amounts of resources to do almost no good. France, Germany, many others are now giving enormous subsidies apparently to pick up the economy. But of course, most of this is going to be imported from China or from Japan or from the US. It's crazy in so many ways, but mostly it's crazy in the way that it spends a lot of resources, basically subsidizing rich people to be able to drive around in cars that don't emit much less, but makes them feel incredibly virtuous. But much more, I think the problem is that the EU is focused on saying we want to cut now with existing technologies, even if it's going to cost a lot. So the EU went from promising to cut 40% in 2030 to cutting 55% in 2030. That is not going to matter very much. We won't be able to measure the impact by the end of the century because of what the EU has done. But the net cost is going to be another set of about 400 billion euros a year. So we basically said we're going to spend another $400 billion, billion euros, and achieve almost nothing. That is unconscionable, especially when the EU is actually not funding more research and development into green energy as they promised. Remember, they're in good company. Pretty much everyone has promised it and nobody's done it. But we should be spending that money instead of on basically funding technology we know doesn't work. We should be funding it on getting better technology for tomorrow, both for ourselves, so we become cheaper for us to make climate policy, but also so the Chinese and the Indians and the Africans will want to do the same.
If we take the three big players, the US, European Union, and China, what would be your advice to each of them presently?
I think it's really hard to get a sensible climate policy before you stop the panic. That's why I wrote the book on false alarm. I think we need to take the panic out of this conversation, because every time people see a storm, they think, oh my God, the world is going to end. Remember, we saw lots and lots of storms last year, and we were told it was a record-setting hurricane year. It was actually one of the weakest globally on the satellite records over the last 40 years. Why? Because the data showed there was not very many, but there was enough that CNN could show us every time there was a hurricane and scare the pants off us. So the fundamental point is we get this scaredness, and everyone peddles this. It worked wonderful. I'm sure also for your media. It's just great to put it on the front page, and it sells papers and get clicks. But the reality is it scares people into making bad policy. If we could get the scaredness away, I think we could get sensible policies both from the EU and from the US. Now, remember, China is at a very different place because they still want to grow. And they have that very implicit but very clear, yeah, we don't have a democracy, but at least we deliver a lot of economic growth to you. And they are going to be very unwilling to say, let's slow down economic growth to cut carbon emissions significantly. And it's going to hurt China a lot more if we really start having these conversations about, for instance, slapping border taxes on if we don't have strong climate action in China. But I actually think in some way we're also wrapped up a little bit. Remember, Europe, the US, waning great powers. We're going to be a very small part of the emissions of the 21st century. China is still going to be a big part of it, but India is going to be just as big a part of it. And Africa, remember, Africa is incredibly poor, about 1 billion people. They want to be much richer. There'll be 2 billion people in 2050, to just 29 years from now. There is an enormous amount of pent-up demand here. So I think even if we manage to get, if Biden manages to sort of arm twist China into saying they're going to start cutting their carbon emissions, we can feel comfortable about saying, oh, we fixed it with EU, China, the US. But we haven't fixed it for all the others. And of course, what will happen is most emission intensive industry will just simply move to Vietnam and Bangladesh and India and eventually to Africa, which will just simply mean we all felt virtuous, but we ended up making everyone else less off, and we didn't actually fix the problem. So lose, lose, lose outcome.
What would you do if you were somehow put in charge of the global climate policies? With the money, of course.
Well, so I think the crucial bit is to recognize we should have a global carbon tax. I also think that's never going to happen. There's a lot of good reasons for that. It's an academically beautiful argument. We should try and push it. We should also recognize that any realistic carbon tax will only solve a minor part of the problem. What we then need to do is to dramatically ramp up our investment in green energy R&D. So Biden has actually promised, he's promised a lot of stuff. He's promised to spend $2 trillion over the next 4 years on climate policies. That's $500 billion a year. Remember, right now, the average American is willing to pay about $24 per person per year. Biden is suggesting to spend $1,500. There's just a mismatch in this number, and I think that will lead eventually to sort of a revolt of voting in another Trump kind of character if you just sort of force that through. But Biden has also asked he's going to dramatically ramp up spending on research and development. Now, You can still make that, you can still bungle that, because obviously companies are going to say, oh, give all that money to us and we'll do research for you, which of course is code for saying we'll make the next product for the next 3 months, or do the stuff that we would have done anyway, mostly. What we need is long-term investment through academics, which is, the cheap stuff that we've been doing, for instance, in medical science for decades. We spend lots of resources on having professors go around and do stuff that's not quite obvious that it'll make us rich. But the point is, some of that stuff will fund the things that will turn into medical breakthroughs in 40 years' time. That's what we need to do for energy. And there's lots of practical stuff on how to do that. So I would say, let's scale back our ambitions on climate policy. There's some smart stuff, and we should have a carbon tax, and we should make policies that are equivalent to our carbon tax. But we should mostly be focusing on research and development into green energy, because if we can get this one or these few technologies, just to give you an example, Craig Venter, the guy who cracked the human genome back in 2000, he has this idea of constructing these algae that soaks up sunlight out on the ocean surface, soak up sunlight and CO2 and produce oil. Now, we know that it's possible. We also know that it's incredibly expensive and really hard to do right now. He's saying, imagine if we could make that cheap. We could basically all produce oil. Well, not you guys, because you don't have ocean, but most people, and certainly the EU, could produce lots of oil. It would all be CO2 neutral because it's just been soaked out on the ocean surface. We could keep our entire economy, and we could go carbon neutral. I'm not saying this is what's going to power the 21st century, because I don't know. I don't think anyone knows. But the whole idea is somebody will come up with that idea, and that's what's going to fix the climate problem much more so. And Gates, for instance, is investing in fourth generation nuclear. They promise it's going to be much safer, much cheaper, modular, all that stuff. And we've been promised a lot for the last 3 generations, so let's see. But maybe that will be it. And then everyone will just embrace that technology and we'll be done with it. Technology solves problems in a way that command economy rarely does. You can do a little bit with command, but you can't get people to spend $1,500 if they're only willing to spend $24. You'll be voted out of office.
What would be your ideal proportion of funds funneled into innovation compared to maintaining the present kind of policies?
We've suggested, backed up by a panel of 3 Nobel laureates and 27 of the world's top climate economists, that you should be spending about $100 billion a year on research and development. Right now, we're spending about 15. So, it's about a 6-fold increase. So a lot of extra money, but in the global scale. So this would be what, 30, 40 billion dollars. So roughly 30, 40 billion euros for the EU. That's a lot less than what we're spending right now. The problem, of course, is what we're spending right now is other people's money. So the EU makes determinations that mean that the electricity gets more costly for you and for me. So we're paying it. But it's not taxes. If you actually have to spend the 40 billion, you have to spend them, and it will have to come from state budgets. So it's easier for politicians to promise that they're just going to do regulation that'll end up costing other people than it is to actually cough up the money themselves. But because 40 billion is a very, very small amount over the whole EU, I don't think this would be a big problem, and it would save us, in the order of many hundreds of billions of dollars. There's a huge conversation about just exactly how much this is, because most of the cost is, as we talked about before, reduction in GDP growth. So it's model-based estimates of losses of how much richer we could have been had we not had that policy.
What would you say to Greta Thunberg if you met her?
So Greta, she actually lives now in the same country as where I am, right? Greta is an interesting person. I've never met her. My sense is she's very, very honest and very concerned and very clearly impressed, just like most other kids that I meet. You see all this terrible news on TV. You get this impression we're just about to die. And she's made that point very clear. There is no future for us. Why should I study when there's no when I might be dead because of global warming by adulthood? That makes a lot of sense. I think the first point I would make, just as we talked about before, for more general, this is not the end of the world. It is incredibly important to understand this means the world will get a lot better by the end of the century, but because of global warming, it'll get slightly less, a lot better. It'll slow down betterness, if you will. That's a very different point than saying this is the end of the world. Obviously, it's still a problem because we'd like the betterness to become as fast as possible. We'd like our grandchildren to have as much opportunity as possible. Climate change will slow the growth of human well-being, and therefore we should still do something about it, but it's much, much less. So I think that's the factual conversation I would try to have with her, because I think everything that she pushes for, and I think what most people push for, flows from that. If you think we're doomed, you will obviously say we should do everything we can. If you realize what the climate science is actually telling us is climate change is a problem, but a reasonably manageable problem, you would realize it's more like all the other problems we face. There's about 1 billion people who are hungry. There's almost 700 million people who are poor. There's 2 billion people who don't have access to clean drinking water and sanitation and electricity. All that. There are lots of other problems in the world. We should fix all of those, and we need to balance our efforts to deal with all of those.
You once said loud and clear that global priorities are bigger than climate change. And actually, your work has been first drawn to my attention when you published the priority list of challenges where the UN would get the most bang for their buck, so to say. Since I assume this to-do list has not really changed until today, would you briefly present it to our audience?
Sure. So one of the things that I've been working a lot with, so my think tank, the Copenhagen Consensus, works on this full time, is to say there are lots of problems in the world, but they're not equally good solutions to all these problems. So, obviously, one big problem in the world, you could argue the biggest problem in the world, is that we all die. Economists would say there's a severe undersupply of immortality, but we don't know how to fix that. So some problems we can fix easily, some problems we can only fix very hardly or not at all. So we've tried to say, what are the smartest solutions across all these areas in the world? We've latest done that together with the UN for the Sustainable Development Goals. We weren't very successful. We told the UN, please, please, please don't promise everything to everyone everywhere. And of course, that was exactly what the UN ended up doing. But what we're trying to do is basically say, there are some places where you can spend €1 and do an amazing amount of good, and some places where you can only do a very, very little. So very conveniently, we published a big book on this, right? But we also just done a one-pager because politicians don't have much time. So we have all the things the UN promised down here. I'll share that so you can share it with your viewers. And each one of them have an economic analysis. How much is this going to cost? How much good is it going to do? And so the length of the line shows how much bang you're going to get for every euro. So if you spend €1 here, you're going to get a lot of euros of good for the world. If you spend €1 here, you're only going to get a little bit. So it's really, really very simple. What we try to tell politicians and everyone, spend your money on the long lines where you can get a lot of bang for your euro. So it turns out that there are some things that are incredibly effective. And this is, again, not rocket science. So get more free trade. Remember, for the last 20 years, we've kind of forgotten about free trade. What was it that lifted about 600 million people out of poverty in China? It was the fact that they could trade with the rest of the world. It was probably one of the best things that's happened in human history. Over 25 years, they lifted more than 600 million people out of poverty. That's an amazing achievement. And we're seeing some of the same things in both Africa and India and elsewhere. Free trade is a major part of that. Free trade is basically that you do what you do best, I do what I do best, we trade, and that makes all of us better off. It's a very simple concept, but we also have forgotten about it since essentially the riots in Seattle and the fall of the whole World Trade Organization negotiations and the Doha round. We just don't talk about it anymore. What we find is that for fairly little money, we could make most people much, much better off, especially people in the developing world. So we estimate we could, if we got more free trade, essentially a successful Doha round, which we've now failed to do. But if we did, we could make every person in the developing world about $1,000 better off per person per year in 2030. That would probably be 2035 by now. But the whole point here is to say, that would solve so many of everyone's problem. Because of course, if you're better off, you can actually provide for your family. You can make sure they don't die from easily curable infectious diseases. You can get them better education. You can get them food, all these other things that would lead to a virtuous circle that would lead to better outcomes pretty much everywhere in the world. The second one, so that's just one of them.
And we would probably get more people interested in climate.
Yeah, well, certainly if you make people better off, they will eventually start caring more about the environment. They will start worrying about their local environment. So they'll stop deforestation, they'll stop air pollution, they'll stop a lot of local things before they'll start worrying about global warming. But yes, it will also lead to better environmental outcomes. Remember, all the places that are rich in the world typically have much better environment than the places that are poor. Just simply because if you're poor, you just worry about, not starving to death by tomorrow. There's a number of other, so let me just give you a few of these other ones. Family planning. There's more than 200 million women who don't have access to family planning. We know that that means they have more kids than they want it to. They often have it at an inconvenient time. That also means that they can have less attention for their kids. If they got that family planning, we know that they could space their kids better, that they could give them better upbringing. There would be less risk of the mothers dying. Overall, and this is crucial because you get slightly fewer kids per year, it also, or per decade, it also means that you get what's known as the demographic dividend. You basically get a society that grows a little faster, and that means that you will leave your descendants better off. We know overall that for every dollar spent, you will probably do about $120 of social good for the world. We look at immunization. That's a big thing right now with COVID, obviously, but it's for the world's poor. We know that for about $1 billion a year, you could save 1 million kids from dying every year. $1,000 will buy you saving a kid's life. We estimate for every dollar spent, you do about $60 of social good. That's incredibly good. Tuberculosis, malaria. Remember, we worry a lot about COVID, which once will kill, a number of million people. Every year, tuberculosis and malaria kills millions of people. And they've done so at least for 100 years, and we don't seem to care all that much. We know how to fix that, and we could do that very, very cheaply. Get good food to small kids. It's not just a very morally good thing to do, but it also turns out if you get good food to these kids, their brains will develop more. So when they get to school, they will learn more and hence come out and be more productive and leave their societies better off in the long run. Every dollar spent or every euro spent will do about 42 euros of social good. There's a long list of these things. These are all, if you will, the boring things in the world. Because remember, climate change and a few other things get all the attention. But it turns out that there's these boring things that just happen to be incredibly cheap, where we could do an amazing amount of good for fairly little money. And my point is simply to say, don't we all want to leave this world as well off as we possibly can? And if we do mean that, we should be spending more of our scarce euros on where we could do the most good first.
You've mentioned free trade. How to wrap one's head around it in the times of globalization dying and being replaced with localization?
So I think a very large part of the problem with free trade was that we overlooked the fact that a significant number of people had real problems with it. So, the Rust Belt in the US as the epitome. And of course, they were part of the people who were, for instance, voting for Donald Trump, just simply because they were dissatisfied with the way that elites had sort of said, yay, let's get cheap stuff from China and then, just forget you. That's a critical part of this point. But I think we also need to recognize that a lot of people have then said, well, maybe trade is not good after all. Because it leads to more air pollution, it leads to more CO2 emissions, it leads to more consumption. Yes, but it also leads to better lives. It especially leads to more economic opportunity in the developing world. We've all seen the roses that get sent from Kenya through Amsterdam and probably end up on your table and many other places. They simply help a whole nation get richer in Africa. And the simple point is to say that if you produce stuff where it's most efficiently produced, everyone can get richer. This is Adam Smith. It's not rocket science anymore. But the point is, we've forgotten that because we've become so scared about other things. Climate is a little bit of it, but there's also just a lot of resentment. A lot of people stand to gain if you say, no, you should only buy within Europe, because then inefficient companies in Europe can survive instead of having to compete with more efficient companies outside of Europe, and so on. But again, we need to stand up and simply say, this is one of the many things where we could make the world a better place at low cost if we focus. My sense is, we're fighting a losing battle in so many ways. I mean, look, it's not like most people are clamoring to embrace my climate advice or all these other things. We're essentially saying the inconvenient truths, that there are some bad policies in climate area, that there are some incredibly good policies that we're overlooking. But if we can simply help people be a little more focused on the smart ideas and a little less focused on the bad ideas, I think I've done my job, and I think there's a real chance that we've made the world better.
What is your take on the ever-rising wealth inequality, and how would you tackle it?
So I think there's a misconception here. It's very, very true that there is an increasing wealth inequality within most rich countries. But if you look at the globe, we have actually seen a dramatic decline in inequality. And that's mostly because we have seen, so if you look from the rise of the industrial age, everybody was poor. And then the rich world, what ended up being the rich world, took off, and the poor world didn't. And by the 1950s, the world was the most unequal if you look at everyone, because if you were born in a rich country, you were incredibly rich. If you were born in a poor country, you were incredibly poor. What has happened now is that there's been a starting of a convergence, because now the poor world is also taking off. And so you've seen, we've lifted 600 million people out of poverty in China. Actually, in 1820, where we first have good data, we estimate more than 95% of all people in the world were what we today would call poor. That is less than $1 per day. It's a long theoretical conversation, but 95%. Today, that number is down below 10%. Because of COVID, it went from 7 up to 9% probably. That's a bad idea, and that's sad, but it will go down. And we're expecting by mid-century, it'll almost be eradicated, the extreme poverty that we're talking about. Most scenarios from the UN shows that there will be a lot less inequality in the future, mostly because of this, because poor countries are catching up to rich countries. Also, remember, we're slowing down, partly because, as we talked about, with climate change, but also just simply because it's harder to keep growing fast when you're a developed economy, because you have nobody to copy, whereas you have people to copy if you're a poor country catching up. So the fundamental point here is, yes, there is rising inequality within countries, but globally there is actually declining inequality. This is amazing, because that means we're leaving a better world globally. Nationally, that's what we have national democracies for. If you believe that inequality is a big issue in your country, you can fight for it. You have the power to vote for these people. We don't have the power to do that internationally, but we do have that power nationally. So I think it's sort of sure, it's a problem, but I think we also need to recognize inequality in most countries, not the US. Most countries was much, much greater around the turn of last century. Then it was really, really unequal, and probably for most of time before that. Then it became incredibly equal in the 1960s for a wide range of areas. And I think that was unsustainable. It's gone up, back up a little bit. And yes, you can say that's a problem. I think it's probably more of a natural place to be. And clearly you can have policies adjust it. I live in a Scandinavian society where we push it down a lot. It takes a lot of effort. It takes a lot of money. It's fine to do so, but it is certainly within your remit to do that, because it's your democratic society. It's not the world. And on the world level, inequality has actually dropped dramatically.
If we take just the rich countries, the tearing of the societal cohesion fabric, what are the main reasons in the rich countries, and how would you tackle those?
So I think, yes, there's a problem in that we're not focusing enough on economic growth. I think that we're seeing the outcome of that more and more people are feeling left behind and don't feel like their kids have a better future to look forward to. It used to be, when you ask most people, do you believe your kids are going to be better off than you? Most people would say yes. That's still true in many developing countries. So China actually tops the list. Most people, and I think rightly so, believe that their kids will be much, much better off in China than they are. And actually, if you look at the UN's own predictions for the world, that is also true in all developed countries. Remember, every year, and this blows my mind, every year, your life expectancy gets 3 months longer. I mean, we'll just live longer and longer because of healthcare. We think, no, that's just in the poorer countries. That's just for, infants, that kind of thing. No, it's actually happening for you. That's why we're much better able to tackle heart disease, not so much cancer, but, we're very, very good at much of this stuff. And we'll get richer and we'll get many, many more opportunity to do all kinds of things. Remember, 40 years ago, almost nobody could fly. That was something the rich elite did. Now everyone can do it. Well, not again under COVID, but we'll get back. There's a lot of things that your kids are going to experience as much, much better. And I think we're somewhat off on that thing. I think the fundamental problem is that we've convinced people the end of the world is nigh. And this is to a very large extent because of global warming and because of environmentalists. Remember, this is not a new claim. In the 1970s, we were told we were going to run out of everything, the Club of Rome, the idea that, all resources would be gone, we'd run out of oil, it'd just be a terrible world. Most people believed it. It was phenomenally wrong. And we knew already back in the 1970s it was wrong. Likewise, we were told acid rain was going to eradicate all of our forests. Again, remember, all of these have kernels of truth. There are problems of running out of stuff. There are certainly problems with acid rain, although it's vastly overblown. The same with the ozone layer. It's not a non-problem, but it's not the end of the world. Climate change has just taken over that. It's the end of the world. So I would say, not only do we have a responsibility to get our priorities right in the sense of realizing climate change is a problem, but not the end of the world, because it makes us make better policy, but also because it stops us being scared for our kids. We need to stop being so scared for our kids that we can't think straight. And of course, that we don't have the breakdown of social cohesion.
Actually, you beautifully wrapped it up in terms of your vision for the 21st century in terms of economic, sociological, and ecological balance. So thanks so much for this great talk. I hope we can do this again sometime in the future.
Yes, and I look very much forward to hear what your readers think, and let's get this conversation going.
Absolutely, great. In the meantime, where can our audience continue to follow you?
So they should try and follow us on Twitter or Facebook or LinkedIn, where I post a lot of my stuff. And of course, we should also publish in your paper. Let's. But we're certainly publishing a lot around the world, so there'll be a lot of stories to see there.
Great. Thanks so much, and do have a great day.
You too. Thank you. Bye.